I'm excited to be here to present some papers that haven't been sent off yet. But we have results and we had a fun time kind of synthesizing this information. I was lucky enough to be part of a NIFA project called the Ranching, Rangelands, and Resilience, which was a large multi and interdisciplinary project looking at, and I think Emily mentioned it, some of the ecological and social dynamics around the West related to resilience. And this idea of resilience that Joel's kind of brought forward here with this symposium has been a quandary for many of us because it's been used as a buzzword to the point where it's almost lost its meaning. And I thought that was a real shame because it's potentially a place where we could sort of find some common ground or start thinking about social and ecological dimensions together. And so I'm going to talk about resilience as a buzzword. And I just want to make sure you all have a chance to look at this long list of great co-authors who stuck with me through this kind of crazy thought experiment that I'm presenting today. So the premise of this presentation is that resilience is creating interdisciplinary collaborations and so I've got results from two studies, one from an ecological lens and one from a social science lens that looks at resilience. And I think there are individual contributions of those lenses, but also synthetic insights for range science and management in particular, which is kind of this in-between field that's concerned with praxis and management, to help us see where there's some mismatches in the two different approaches and how we're thinking about resilience, particularly as they come to the scale, temporal and spatial, and also the agency. When we say agency in social science, we mean people's ability to do something about it. And then I'm going to argue at the end of this presentation, if Joel doesn't cut me off, I'm going to argue that we could engage with this idea from Donna Haraway, she's a philosopher, of staying with the trouble. And I'm going to argue that if we continue to commit to dialogue and collaboration among these different lenses of resilience, or these different theoretical lenses, we'll start to see the beyond pasture needs for strategies and action, and we'll start to get somewhere in our collaborations. And the subtext for this is, as a postdoc on this project, I saw folks just flying by each other disciplinarily. And I'm always kind of caught in the middle. I don't know, maybe it was because I was a kid and when my parents got divorced, I was always trying to get them to see each other's point of view or something. And I grew up to do that in my professional work. And so here I'm trying to sort of reconcile these different lenses to bring the social, the range science, and the ecology kind of together. Not a transdisciplinary integration, but maybe a little bit more interdisciplinary. So I'll start out with the first study. So walk with me through the ecological lens of resilience, and we'll think about it a little bit more carefully. Andrew Felton, Bob Shriver, Peter Adler, and the sensitivity team at Utah State led this project, and they used historical satellite-based data of forage production and weather to build ecoregion specific statistical models of forage sensitivity to temperature and precipitation variability. And they fed projections from 11 different climate models through those statistical models to project mid-century changes to forage across the Western US rangeland sectors. And they focused on growing season weather. And there's some limitations to this. Of course, the models are based on historical relationships. So we're not modeling future CO2 or warming. And it's potentially more pessimistic because it does not include those other factors. And these on the right here, this figure is are those ecoregions, the hot deserts, cold deserts, California annual grasslands, northern mixed prairies, and short grass steppes. And those ecoregions also relate to our social data that I'm going to present on later. The projections are for mid-century percent change in average production under high emission scenarios, the projections of mid-century change in the probability of years of low forage production, which are defined as 75%, less than 75% of the historical mean, and the maps are aggregated at the county level of these projections. So here's the big picture. This figure on the left is average change in forage production, and on the right, it's average change in probability of a bad year, aggregated at the county level. The southern plains and the hot deserts under these projections are particularly vulnerable to change in the probability of a bad year. I'm actually feeling quite pleased about sitting in Dubois, Idaho at the moment, taking a look at these maps. So this dark red is up to 256% increased change in probability of a bad year across the Western US. But take a look at the hot deserts here, and then also the short grass steppe. And those are some pretty alarming rates of probability of a bad year. The northern mixed prairies are there as well. So they predicted smaller changes in forage production by mid-century for northern Great Basin and California annual rangelands relative to those other ecoregions, and larger changes in the southwestern US. So the southwestern and southern plains appear to be the most vulnerable, and they recommend that those are the places in the country where there's the most urgent need for adaptation. Okay, the second lens that I would like to present is the social science lens. So while we were working on those projections, another team went out and did a series of focus groups in the same ecoregions: Western Nebraska, Northeast Colorado, Northern and Southern Utah, Gila County, Arizona, Southern California, and Humboldt County, Nevada. And they convened focus groups with public lands managers, except in Nebraska, where they weren't available on the west side of the state, as well as with 8 to 10 ranchers. And we sought out folks who'd been ranching for 20 years. And these focus groups emphasized learning about what ranchers were dealing with in terms of stressors and challenges, what opportunities they saw to deal with those stressors and challenges. We also had them walk us through a production calendar, tell us what a good year is like here, tell us what a bad year is like here. And we coded those focus groups to better understand how ranchers see resilience. What's their point of view of what's working, what's not working? How are they dealing with these stressors? I presented this last night to the Clark County, Idaho Stock Growers Association, and I think it resonated with them as well. We've got a story map coming out on the social side of the project. It's not out yet, but essentially this figure kind of summarizes what the ranchers across those different regions told us. And essentially the height of the bar here is sort of represents more agency or more ability for ranchers to act about 4 different types of change. So essentially we have 4 different interconnected social ecological ways of thinking about resilience. And so ranchers really told us they had a lot of tools in the toolbox and a lot of understanding around dealing with changing ecological conditions, but they had less and less ability to deal with changing economic conditions, changing ranching communities, and changing rangeland uses, including seeing more recreationists, more development, more transition out of ranching uses. And so here we list some of the tools that people are using, and this is pretty straightforward. Ranchers are ranchers. They're really good at ranching. They're not necessarily politicians and lawyers, or the folks that we talk to didn't necessarily have tools to deal with some of these other challenges. And so we categorize some of the threats, the scales of adaptation that people are working at, and some of the examples of the ways that they were adapting, and really found that at an individual ranch scale, folks had a lot of tools in the toolbox, a lot of forms of resilience across the system. But at the system-wide scale, even community and larger scales, whether that's temporal or spatial, they oftentimes didn't have much to draw from in terms of solutions. So we always like to put in our qualitative quotes. I'll just read quickly the one at the bottom. This rancher in northern Utah said, "I played with everything to try to get my cattle to where I think will work, and it's a challenge. Is the juice worth the squeeze? All the effort you go into it, do you see a return?" So that speaks to the economic challenges that producers are facing, the low profit margins, they're producing high quality beef, but they're just not seeing the return. So there was a lot of discussion about whether ranchers actually have any agency to do what they want to do. Do they make decisions? Do they have decision-making capability? And where does that come from? And that mismatch between the scale of the problem and the agency that folks have on the ground. So to summarize, we talked about 2 studies, and I tried to break these studies down into thinking about the temporal scales, the spatial scales, the metrics, and the implications that the two lenses bring to the table. We had ranchers with 20 plus years of retrospective perspective, and that's a really different scale than the 30-year mid-century predictive power of the climate science. Those two things really miss. So I'm going to argue that these two lenses of resilience give us three things to think about. The first is that when we work in rangeland science, it's necessary that we talk about applied knowledge and praxis. So even if we're working at kind of these grand social and ecological scales that talk about big picture threats and big picture challenges, there needs to be an applied piece there that folks can take and use on the ground. And that's what the rangeland ecology brings to the table. The second insight is that social ecological relationships, and I distinguish those two, operate at larger structural or temporal scales than is often acknowledged in range management research. So this is analogous to the weather versus climate issue in climate science, but it's also as simple as this idea that sociologists have been using since the 80s, which is leaving the farm gate. That the problems and therefore some of the workable solutions are coming from a larger scale. And Nathan talked about this a bit in his plenary. And the third is that understanding these broader scales of interaction and operationalizing resilience as a true boundary object requires us to do this thing called staying with the trouble, or sticking with it and having these conversations together. So we showed the climate projections to the range folks and to the social scientists. They pushed back and said, ranchers are worried at more of the weather scale. They're dealing with today's challenges. They're dealing with what I call the bear in the water trough. There are things that come up that you've got to do to keep your ranch operating. And how am I supposed to think about mid-century projections? But there's an opportunity there when we extend the time scale of how we're talking from a retrospective look to a forward-looking look at mid-century, which is really not that far ahead. When I worked in Southeast Alaska, folks talked about sustainability goals extending to 8 generations in the future. So mid-century is not, an unheard of scale for resilience or sustainability goals. And so it brings into light an imagination about what we're managing for, and to think at eco-regional scales as well. And then it challenges us to start thinking about what levers can we pull now and where to adapt to these changes we see as coming. At the same time, the social approach is really hard to operationalize. Not only do we get criticized for using a lot of jargon, or reframing everything as just political ecological and bringing class and everything, it's hard to know how to use that info. Okay, so ranchers don't have a lot of capacity to deal with big social problems. Well, none of us feel like we do. What do we do about that? I think some ways to think about it are that we can think beyond farm gate. The ranchers are pushing us to see beyond the scale of an individual ranch decision maker, which is actually a pretty patriarchal way of thinking about how range decision making works, and it's inaccurate. So we can see the value of social ecological knowledge. We've been really obsessed with like rancher local knowledge of plant herbivore interactions, which is only so interesting. They know a lot about political economy too. They know a lot about what's happening, what consumers want, what's happening at larger scales with the economy. So we're thinking about community or land use interventions that enable climate adaptation at a larger scale. And again, asking what levers do we have and what can we pull from? So relationship structural scales are hard to reconcile in these two perspectives. And the way that I think about it is if you take these projections that you often see in the climate science about human or anthropogenic driven climate change, and you think about what the ranchers are telling us about resilience, the same processes that are driving these challenges to resilience are driving these changes in our climate. And so we have an obligation to theorize and to converse and to bring down to the ground solutions for these interconnected social and ecological processes. Staying with the trouble is Donna Haraway's framework for multi-species kin making that reimagines a generative approach of human-nature relations. She says she's a post-humanist. She develops this idea in a volume of the same title focused on a feminist philosophy of collective subjectivity. She basically argues that we're not individuals, and she likens this mixing to compost. So staying with the trouble is this idea I think we can use in climate science and range ecology to acknowledge our collective ecological interdependence and the responsibilities, or what Hailey calls responsibilities, relationships, and commitment to dialogue necessary to address resilient human nature thriving. What am I talking about? I'm bringing in this philosophy. Well, when we consider together that these studies leave us with troubling questions, or those questions that push us towards a sort of interdisciplinary dialogue about relationships that really address rangeland resilience and beyond, we might start asking, how do we reconcile social knowledge that's relevant to managers with long-term predictions of change? If ranchers are saying, we don't need to know what's going to happen with forage in 50 years because I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, or I have no idea who's going to be here in 50 years. We should pay attention to that. How can we think and act for longer term resilience in that context? How will ranch and community level decision-making scales respond to global and climate change? How can researchers and practitioners mobilize beyond ranch level strategies? We've been talking a lot about collaboration. Are there bigger pieces to the puzzle there? What are our metrics? How would we inclusively value each lens and interactions among different systems and scales? How would we actually meaningfully do that in our research and in our practice? And what's limiting the analysis and meaningful action? I would argue that it's literacy in one another's fields and respect for one another's fields. If as soon as we get turned off by a word or a theory or an approach to dialogue, we turn down, we shut down. We're not going to have this with this interaction. We're not going to learn. And then we've got to think about the implications for whom. Who will deal with the consequences of the change? Who's supposed to act as a result of our information? Who has the capacity and agency to address change at multiple scales? Is it just the rancher? So Hailey says, the details matter. Each time a story helps me remember what I thought I knew or introduces me to new knowledge, a muscle critical for caring about flourishing gets some aerobic exercise. Such exercise enhances collective thinking and movement in complexity. Each time I trace a tangle and add a few threads that at first seemed whimsical, but turned out to be central to the fabric, I get a bit straighter. That staying with the trouble of complex worlding is the name of the game. Love, living, and dying well together on Terra Terrapolis. We're all responsible to and for shaping conditions for multi-species flourishing in the face of terrible histories, and sometimes joyful histories too. But we are not all responsible in the same ways. The differences matter in ecologies, economies, species, and lives. So I think rangelands necessitate an inclusion of multiple areas of knowledge and practice and give us an opportunity to construct new imaginaries or to reimagine the future for systems facing these multifaceted change, but only if we stay with it.